Good morning.
Yo.
Welcome to this morning's Real Talk. Today, let's talk about protagonists.
Yeah, so this is
Part two.
part two of the writing a story,
How to write a story.
how to write a story little series that we're doing. So yeah, let's talk about protagonist, your main character.
Why do you need one? No, I'm just kidding.
Because you need a plot.
Because people need to care.
So protagonist, for anybody who didn't know, is your main character of your story. It's the main point at which your entire story unfolds and revolves around.
The main thing that something happens to.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be a person necessarily.
Doesn't have to be a person. And in fact, when I started like learning the terms and stuff of story writing, I always thought that the protagonist was the good guy. Had to be so before I really actually learned what it was, I didn't think that the protagonist was the main character. I thought, well, the good guy is the protagonist.
So you would have like in like a mob film, the police, they would be the protagonist.
The protagonist, even if they're not the main character.
And the antagonists would have been the mobsters who the story was about.
Right. Whereas I realized, later I realized, whoever's your main character, that's the protagonist.
It's a lot simpler than what.
Yeah, I had to really confuse.
Yeah, because like I could see that being a really hard question to answer if like
who's
what
the
you thought it was.
right.
Who's the protagonist in this film? You'd be like,
I don't know who's
the good guy.
There wasn't really any very good people.
And then in an amoral society, how do you know?
Right.
So that's good. Well, at least you had an idea of what a protagonist was. When I first started, I had no idea. I didn't know what a protagonist was. I didn't know what an antagonist was. I think I had to Google it in like one of our very first writing classes because like that term kept getting thrown around. So at least you understood that like the words had something to do with a story.
Sure.
But as I was sitting there, I'm like, I don't know what any of this means. And so I sadly had to Google what a protagonist and antagonist was.
Hopefully you still have to.
No, I don't. No, I do not.
So how do you write one?
How do I write one?
Yeah, what makes a good protagonist?
Well, those are two different questions. I don't write good ones, I'm assuming. No, I'm just kidding. Self-deprecation. For me, I would say my protagonists usually start off kind of, I don't know if amorphous is the term. I think it is. But they usually don't have form. It's kind of like, I might know like their gender. I might know a little bit about their backstory.
Mm-hmm.
But like as far as like, do they have a scar across their face? Or what does their voice sound like? A lot of that type of stuff, I don't necessarily know until I start writing them into the story and putting them through situations and tests and trials.
Yeah. Once you start figuring out what you want to do with them, you kind of figure out the little nitpicky like details of how they look.
And so how do you write one? It's like my protagonist, I would argue, is never finished until the film is finished.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the main thing that I look towards as far as how do I write one is rule number one: the protagonist has to go through something.
Yeah.
Many things. It has to push them into a world that they're uncomfortable with, that they don't know, that challenges them and makes them change. And they always end the film different than they started the film, and they can never go back to how they started.
Yep.
That's how I write a protagonist. Very hero's journey, very Vogler, very McKee. Because it's satisfying to me.
I would say that's how I think a protagonist should be written too. And I like thinking about it in those terms of like, well, your main character has to start here. And in the end, they have to end here.
Right.
The stuff in between is is fun. And you could throw a lot of different stuff at them for like character building and stuff. But essentially what you said, like, they just have to end up changed and unable to go back to their ordinary world. Not necessarily geographically, they can go back geographically, but they can't go back to their original life.
Right.
They've changed.
Where they set off from.
And so I think your hero, your main character, and the things that you can throw at them are only as good as your ordinary world, your setup for them. Because if you have a convincing ordinary world, not like, oh yes, this is, like I don't feel like I'm seeing the smoke and mirrors, more like I buy that this character is here.
Believable.
I believe this character. If you can establish that, the stuff that you throw at them can kind of be whatever whatever you want, as long as it fit, in the context of your film.
Sure.
Obviously, if you're making a Western, don't just, throw an alien in there for whatever. But within the context of your film, you can really throw anything at them, because at that point, it's just a game of seeing how your character's going to react.
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on that.
Disagree away.
I think what you throw at your character always has to attempt to weaken them, break them down, or change them in some way, shape, or form.
Yes, yep.
And I think if you're writing a scene where a scenario doesn't do that, that scene needs to be thrown out. I think if your scene is as simple as he walks up to get a candy bar out of the vending machine, and he gets his candy bar and walks away. End of scene.
Yeah.
It's totally what's going to change him? I don't know. He's going to eat that candy bar and maybe gain a couple calories.
Right.
That doesn't really do anything for a viewer.
I don't buy it.
So I disagree that what your character goes through doesn't really matter as long as it makes sense in the world. I think, in fact, I'm almost on the opposite idea of your character can go through something totally different and should go through pretty much everything different than their ordinary world, because when they decide to set out on their journey, they're making an active decision to seek something different. And I think they should experience what they don't know. And what they don't know is outside their ordinary world, and therefore it's the antithesis to their ordinary world.
Right.
And if it is too ordinary world, you should remove that from your screenplay.
Right.
Because the audience will not be entertained, they won't care, and there's no purpose or connection that your character has with the story at that point. It's just them getting a glass of milk.
Yeah, totally. And so I guess maybe...
I mean, unless you're writing maybe like a sitcom or a television show where you got to fill time. But
maybe
then,
saying that putting anything in their way was the wrong message I'm trying to portray. Because I was saying I agree that they all need to be something that challenges them, and they all need to be something that breaks them down and lets them come out on some kind of other scale, the ebb and flow of things, to the ultimate end change. Those need to be there, and we could talk about more of those when we're talking about, the beats of action, and all that stuff, trials and tribulations.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, like, if you have a convincing enough ordinary world, I think...
Well, that's your start.
Yeah.
I mean, your ordinary world for your protagonist helps us understand where your character is in their identity.
Yeah.
And in a good protagonist, when they move through their trials and tribulations, they move from their identity to their essence. They move from what they believe they are and what they believe they want to be into their true calling and what they're supposed to be. And if you can do that correctly, and if you can do that with the right set of circumstances between beginning and end of film, you'll give a compelling protagonist.
Yeah.
And that's where, taking the candy bar vending machine scenario, it's like you don't have to just let them go to the vending machine to get a candy bar. You could then, there's where the bully's waiting.
Right.
And the bully takes a cheap shot to punch our kid, and he blocks him and knocks him out, and then he gets expelled.
Right.
Okay, now you've built a character that's going through something where he was the victim and he got the consequence.
Right.
Okay, now how does he react to that?
Or you could go Or you could go a situation where, okay, he goes to get a candy bar, puts his dollar in, and it eats his money.
Right. Right.
Is he gonna? How's
Yeah,
he gonna
right.
react? Is he gonna smash the
Right.
glass? Is he gonna?
And if it's a film like Groundhog's Day and he's figured out he's in this perpetual loop, it's
gonna
going to
do
be
all kind-
miserable.
yeah,
And he's
right.
going to be like, and maybe the next day he doesn't put his money in just to see what happens.
Right.
So, but those are unique circumstances and scenarios. Like, and your character should always go into a scenario expecting one thing, and then something totally unexpected happens to them, which forces them to do something else. That pulls us into
Yeah.
the next scene. One thing that I think I would say I'm most frustrated with in modern day cinema, which really a lot of times messes me up with movies and why I end up hating them, is because they write the protagonist in a way where what I just laid out doesn't happen. It's becoming a trend,
Yeah.
which has been very frustrating. I think Star Wars, the current trilogy, 7, 8, and 9, those are evident, where Rey, we only know she's the protagonist because she has all this mystery around her and she's conflicted. And
Yeah.
for some reason, the story, everyone in the film tells us it's about her and she's important for some reason. But she doesn't do much and she doesn't have a lot of struggles in her way. She
Yeah.
has like these moments, like I think like in, what is it, 8, she's in that glass cave on the island with Luke and you're just like, okay, she's conflicted. She's in a cavern. She doesn't know who she is. Like, that's her struggle. But it's like, it's so man versus self. And there's very little outward forces that can completely destroy her.
Yeah.
Even Kylo proves
Yeah.
to be
right.
a
Never
force
can beat her.
that's not
Never
very
beats her.
threatening.
Yeah.
Like, she might be scared of him, but that's, again, her own self-doubt. That's her, it's man versus self
Right.
at that time. And so
Never saw her get beat. I think that's the idea of like consequences don't have consequences,
Right.
or our main character doesn't have to struggle. I think that's pretty pervasive in modern cinema, like you're saying, and I think it exists a lot in like the Disney, Marvel, Star Wars universe.
I think that's where Scorsese kind of was coming from when he's, not to put words in his mouth, but when he spoke on the idea that
They're like
those
theme
are
parks.
those are theme park films,
Yeah,
theme park movies. I think that's what he meant.
sure.
I mean, even take Iron Man's death at the end of Endgame. You were just like, okay, I guess I have to be sad because everybody's crying.
right.
They could have done something so much more, miraculous with his death. Something that, like,
right.
I mean, yeah, what he did was selfless, but, like, even then.
I mean, I guess still though you could argue that his arc was that he made an ultimately selfless act.
Sure.
And
yeah, but you know what
he
it was?
is historically
You know what it
selfish.
was? It didn't move him into his essence. Iron Man didn't become who Iron Man was supposed to be by killing him, by sacrificing himself.
And I would say that's because he had kind of already come into his essence. We had already seen that character kind of come into his essence. So
give himself selflessly
So I could
for
see
the
why that
team and
seemed like
figure out how to work with people. But
Yeah.
it was just kind of whatever.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's where Scorsese probably is like getting off on those types of comments where he's just like, look, like, you look at Taxi Driver, you look at even The Irishman that he just released. It's like,
haven't seen it.
he writes characters in a way where you feel so conflicted and sad for their well-being. Joker. It's like, we know Joker.
But he didn't do Joker, but
I know, but I'm just pointing out Joker as a good character.
Sure.
Like, we have a character who is so conflicted. We know him to be the worst supervillain ever. And what he does is terrible, and we feel bad that he has to go through this.
Yeah.
That's how you write a protagonist.
Yeah. So talking on this point,
Yeah.
you threw out a few, but what's like if you could give somebody a definitive, at least in your opinion, go watch this character, go
Sure.
watch this movie, that is the example of a good protagonist and what they need to achieve story-wise to be a compelling protagonist.
What they need to achieve or what they do achieve.
Or what they do achieve.
Yeah.
Just
I think
what's a good example? in
I
your
think a
mind?
good one for me that stands the test of time is Oscar Schindler in Schindler's List. I think you have a character piece about one man's struggle with his identity as being a war profiteer and trying to be the best businessman he knows how to be in his time and circumstances. That's his longing. That's what he wants. But then realizing what he's doing is an abomination and supporting horrible, horrific acts towards other fellow human beings who bleed the same way he does and feels the same way he does.
Yeah.
And he steps from his identity into his essence of identity being I'm going to be a war profiteer and use these people, to essence I'm going to be a martyr and protect and save these people. His identity was I wanted to make as much money off of these people. Now I'm going to spend all my money to save these people.
Yeah.
And so like that transformation in that character arc is to me and the way they set him up, going back to your ordinary world setup, the way they set up his identity in the ordinary world is profound.
Yeah.
The way he puts the pin on, counts his money, finds the nicest suit, all of these
Right.
things, you believe what he's going to become.
Yeah.
And then as he transforms and he witnesses the atrocities that his friends, the people he wants to justify as being good people, as he sees that happening, he finally has a moral conundrum and says, I have to do the right thing.
Right.
I think he's on point as one of the top protagonists in history.
I'd probably
Cinema history.
agree
Cinema
for sure. I think that's a good one. I would say maybe an example for me from more modern stuff is Mando from The Mandalorian. And now it's a little different because it's a TV show.
Yeah, same thing, though.
It's same thing, and they still need to go through an arc. I guess it's a little different because right now it's just season 1 is out, and yes, he achieved an arc, but it's not his complete arc.
But just like a scene has to have the same beats of action and reaction as a whole film,
Right.
so does one season to a whole series.
Totally. And I think they achieved that, and I think
good.
I haven't seen a modern day, especially from Disney, protagonist be as strong as this, and I think the reasons that he is really strong is because the identity essence question is played up so well, and it's like his sense of belonging being this kind of catalyst that pulls him on either side is really cool because his identity, he is a Mandalorian, but he's not. Spoilers, sorry, before I go into that, but he's not. By like episode 1, you understand he's not actually birthright a Mandalorian.
Sure.
He is that in practice only. So then he's being pulled all the time.
His identity pulls him towards the Mandalorian culture, whereas essence is pulling him in a different direction.
Right. And so it's all this idea of like, where do I belong?
Yeah,
Who
great.
actually am I? And it's all done then in this very exciting world that, I feel like a lot of films miss the mark on sometimes just on excitement level and having, like you said, like we were talking about earlier, having real consequences. Like, man, there's stuff happens in this show and it's permanent and it there's consequences. And, I would say like I have some from old examples too, but I wanted to give, because you said Oscar
cool.
Schindler, I liked to give a little bit of, an old one to look at and more of a modern, like this is a good one currently happening.
So that's what I got for Protagonist. I think it was fun.
Yeah, no.
Hopefully you guys thought it was interesting. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Real Talk. Like, share, and subscribe. And if you got any cool inputs, leave them in the comments down below. See you later.
So yeah.